So that's flax seeds and blood pressure. But of course, no discussion of blood pressure is complete without a discussion of salt and sodium, right? So we know that salt is composed of both a positively charged sodium ion and a negatively charged chloride ion. And when you eat more salt, you have more salt in your bloodstream. And of course, we all remember from high school biology that water is a polar molecule with a very negative component to it. So when we have more positively charged sodium ions in the bloodstream, we then attract more of those negatively polar water molecules to that positive charge, which means we hold more water in the bloodstream, which means that water exerts more pressure on the walls of the vessel, which means we have a higher blood pressure, right? This is the premise of why dietary sodium is problematic when it comes to blood pressure. And of course, the first thing that patients always say is, I don't have a salt shaker, which is good. That's a good first step. But we also know that 77% of dietary sodium, it's not coming from the salt shaker. It's coming from processed foods and it's coming from restaurant foods. So to explore this a little more deeply, I have a game for you guys. We're going to play this Price is Right style. I'm going to show you a showcase, which is a meal, and you guys are going to guess how many milligrams of sodium you think is in this showcase. So we have here, this is actually very fitting, a hamburger. I didn't plan this. Hamburger, fries, and coleslaw. Keep in mind, the recommended amount of sodium for a day is about 1,500 milligrams. 2,300 milligrams is like the safe upper limit. I'll take some guesses. Who wants to guess how much sodium is in this meal, in this showcase? And of course, as close as you can without going over.
I'm going to say 2,800.
2,800. Okay. JB.
2801.
2801. I love it. I love it. I love it. Robert?
950.
950. Okay. Angelica?
1080.
1080. Any other guesses? Dr. Ohanian?
3,500.
3,500. Any other takers? 1,200. All right. Let's go through it. The hamburger alone contains 1,500 milligrams of sodium, right? So there's your day. There's your day's worth. Can't eat anything else. Just the hamburger. You throw in the fries, you get another 884. And then you add in the coleslaw, you get 382. If you put it all together, we have a whopping, I know, Richard was close, but he was over. I actually don't know who it ended up being because.
As long as JB was.
Who was it? I'm not sure. Was it Angelica? Yeah, because you guessed 10-8. There we go. There we go. So there we go. The other thing is you can never predict how much sodium is going to be inside something. So let's imagine you go to Dunkin' Donuts and you're choosing between this corn muffin and the wake up wrap, which has eggs, cheese, and bacon. Which do you think has more sodium? Who thinks it's the corn muffin? And who thinks it's the wake up wrap?
I know that name has sodium.
Yeah, so this astounds me every time I see numbers like this, which is like you would think that the cheese and the bacon and the eggs would blow the corn muffin out of the water, but you can find sodium in all kinds of places. Here's another one. Let's say you go to Chick-fil-A and you're trying to decide between the Cobb salad and the original Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich, which has more sodium. Who thinks it's the Cobb salad?
With dressing.
And with dressing. And who thinks it's the original sandwich? Okay, so these numbers astound me. It's a lot more. It's a lot more. So again, sodium is just kind of everywhere, and you can't always predict how much you're going to find in any given place. So now let's turn our attention to processed foods. So which processed food do you think contributes the greatest amount of sodium to the average American diet? Do you think it's soups and canned foods? Is it bread? Or is it salty snacks like chips and that sort of stuff? So who thinks it's the canned foods? Who thinks it's bread? And who thinks it's salty snacks? Okay, yeah, so it's bread. So you guys are good. Maybe I made these too easy. But if you look at the top 10 sources of sodium in the American diet, bread tops it off. And the reason is not because bread, like one slice of bread is so rich in sodium, but it's because people eat so much of it, right? So that ends up being the greatest amount. Number 2 is pizza, then hamburgers and sandwiches, cold cuts and cured meats, soups, burritos and tacos, savory snacks is number 7, chicken number 8, cheese number 9, and then interestingly, eggs and omelets number 10. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that these are population averages, right? The patient that's sitting in front of you may very well be getting all of their sodium from chips or from their cheese and their cold cuts that they eat every day. But at the population level, this is how things stack up. This is an interesting tool that you might want to try yourself, and if you have the right patient, you could recommend it to them. It's a sodium calculator where basically you put in what you typically eat, and it's a validated tool. I actually know the scientist who created it. I was actually in the study where they validated it. I had to do like a 24-hour urine sodium collection and like report what I ate, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that it's good data, and they kind of estimate how much sodium you're eating based on your little kind of like self-report of what you eat every day. So that's one tool that you might check out if you're interested. Now, the other thing that is so fascinating about sodium and blood pressure is this concept called salt sensitivity. So it's the idea that sodium doesn't actually affect everyone's blood pressure the same way. We know some people can eat as much salt as they want and their blood pressure doesn't increase, and other people eat a very small amount and they do get this large increase. I want to explore this for a second because, like I said, I think it's quite fascinating. There are genetic tests that can tell you if you're salt sensitive or not. Those things where, you take your saliva, you mail it off, and they give you a report back on your genes and how you need to change your lifestyle based on them. But you don't actually have to do this in order to get some sense of some groups that may be more salt sensitive compared to others. So what we know from the literature is that African Americans are uniquely salt sensitive. So this is a study that shows you the average increase in systolic blood pressure when varying amounts of sodium are fed to Caucasian Americans and African Americans. And what you can see is that that no matter what amount of salt is eaten, the African Americans are having a significantly higher increase in their systolic blood pressure compared to the Caucasian Americans. And this increases as the sodium intake increases. But there's something very interesting about this, which is that as potassium intakes increase, racial disparities in blood pressure disappear. And I'm going to show you a couple of different pieces of data that demonstrate this. But here you can see that as their potassium intakes along the x-axis increase, the differences between the two groups go down. So this is a study where they took African Americans and Caucasian Americans. They fed them varying amounts of potassium along the x-axis. And then they compared the change in blood pressure in relation to a salt load that they consumed. And what you can see is that when they had low potassium intakes, there's this clear difference between the African Americans and the Caucasian Americans. But then when you get up to a very high potassium intake, that difference disappears. So this is very, very interesting. Once again, just like the balance between omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids has been disrupted by our modern diets, sodium and potassium also exist in a balance. Historically, we ate 7 times more potassium than sodium. Today, we eat 3 times more sodium than potassium, and this is part of the problem. So this is a study published in the New England Journal that basically showed for everyone, irrespective of who they are, where they're from, increasing potassium intakes lead to lower blood pressure. And this is demonstrated for systolic blood pressure as well as diastolic blood pressure. And this has to do with what's happening at the distal convoluted tubule. It's actually at the same site where thiazide diuretics act. What we know is that a lot of the body's sodium regulation is happening at the level of the sodium chloride cotransporter at the distal convoluted tubule. So if you have a low serum sodium, the sodium chloride cotransporter is going to reabsorb more salt to increase your blood pressure. That's pretty simple and that makes sense. But what also happens is if you have a low dietary potassium level, and that's a low serum potassium level, your sodium chloride cotransporter, for some reason, then also reabsorbs more salt. It has to do, I think, with what's going on with the channels on the other side of the cell. So low potassium diets also increase blood pressure by the reabsorption of sodium. And the worst thing is if you have a low potassium diet that is also high in sodium, now for some reason, paradoxically, the sodium chloride cotransporter reabsorbs even more salt and produces an even higher blood pressure. So the conclusion of this study published in the New England Journal was that the only thing worse than a high sodium diet is a high sodium diet that is also low in potassium. And that is what we've got. So this is data that showed that 99.4% of Americans consume more than 1,500 milligrams of sodium, the recommended amount, and less than 2.5% consume 4,700 milligrams of potassium, which is the recommendation for potassium. I do want to talk about the recommendation. So if you remember from that slide a moment ago, when we looked at those disparities disappearing, it happened around 4,700 milligrams, which also happened to be the previous recommendation for potassium intakes. So there is this group called the Institute of Medicine. They're a non-governmental organization located in Washington. They convene experts who come together to basically tell us how much we should eat of all of the different vitamins and minerals. They get together from time to time and revise their recommendations. Prior to 2019, they said everyone should eat 4,700 milligrams of potassium per day. That makes sense based on the data we looked at, because we saw like that's an amount that can eliminate disparities in salt sensitivity. Sounds reasonable. Interestingly, after 2019, they revised their recommendations and they actually lowered it. They said women should have 2,600 milligrams per day and men should have 3,400. The important thing that I want you guys to recognize about this is that the recommendations that are put out by the Institute of Medicine are for healthy populations. So this probably is accurate for a population that's healthy, but it's not for hypertensive populations, and it's not based on different ethnic groups and such. So people get really worked up about these recommendations, but at the end of the day, like, it's very difficult. They are what they are. They're population averages, and you have to remember that the individual who's sitting in front of you is unique and may this might be what's right for them, or maybe the old recommendation might be what's right for them. But definitely these recommendations are for healthy populations, not sick and multi-morbidly chronic disease populations. Okay, so let's keep talking about potassium for a moment. What do you think is the best dietary source of potassium? Is it potatoes, avocados, 3/4 of a cup, I should say 1 potato, 1 avocado, 3/4 of a cup of beans, or 1 banana? Think about it for a moment, and I'll get you guys to guess. So who thinks it's the potato? Who thinks it's the avocado? 3/4 of a cup of beans, and 1 banana. Okay, let's take a look. They're actually in order. So yeah, potatoes top it off. 926 milligrams of potassium per potato. By the way, this applies to both white and sweet potatoes. They're both about the same. The avocados next with 690. 3/4 of a cup of beans have 540, and then the bananas. Each banana has about 422.
It's the skin, right? It's mostly the skin.
In the potato, yeah. Sorry, that's a good point. You must eat the skin in order to get the maximum amount of potassium. If you stack up the top dietary sources of potassium, they're right here. You can see that it's mostly, vegetables basically, and some fruits and beans. If you eat low sodium tomato juice, you can get some potassium. Salsa has a lot of potassium, which is good to know in a tomato sauce. Halibut and tuna fish do okay, but they're unique among fish. It's not a universal thing. Yogurt and milk have a small amount as well. And yeah, so these are the best sources. But as you can see, if you're aiming for 4,700 milligrams per day, you're going to need to eat a lot of these foods in order to get there. Is it possible? It's theoretically possible. It would just be very difficult. So you'd have to eat bananas and yogurt for breakfast, and then like a snack of honeydew melon, and then an avocado and some tomato juice at your lunch, and then another snack of cantaloupe melon and some raisins at dinner. You'd have to have, specifically halibut fish, some beans, maybe some spinach, and then a snack of cherries. And if you did all of that, you would get your 4,700 milligrams of potassium. But when you look at the data, so the top sources of potassium in the American diet, potatoes, that kind of makes sense. But then interestingly, milk, okay, because milk has some. But then coffee and tea, which are like not even legitimate sources, manage to contribute most of the potassium that we eat. So it's possible to get that amount, but also the more people get, the better. So it's, you just aim for as much as you can get. Now you're probably thinking, well, a lot of our patients with high blood pressure are taking ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers, right? Which are theoretically potassium sparing medications that could theoretically increase people's potassium levels. This is a study also actually done by someone I went to grad school with, but they basically took a hypertensive population. They fed them 10 servings of fruits and vegetables every day, and these people were on ACE inhibitors and ARBs, and they wanted to see if they were going to increase their risk for hyperkalemia by being on that very, very high fruit and vegetable diet, and what they showed is that it didn't. So if you have patients on ACE and ARBs, you don't have to worry about telling them to eat more potassium. It probably is not going to give them hyperkalemia. And then, of course, there's our chronic kidney disease patients, right? There's also issues around potassium intakes in this population, who of course typically also has high blood pressure. It's interesting, different people give different recommendations, but it seems the consensus is that unless they are hyperkalemic, we probably don't need to limit their potassium intake. So the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recommends that if they have CKD stage 3 to 5, Only if they have hyperkalemia should you limit their dietary potassium. And you can see limited to less than 2.4 grams per day. Like most people are not even going to be anywhere near that. And then the National Kidney Foundation's Quality Initiative guidelines, they said limit it to 2 to 4. But again, how many people are going to be consuming more than 4 grams per day? Probably not that many. So I don't think this is probably as big an issue as it sometimes feels like it is. This is really fascinating. So this is data published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which is the top nutrition journal in the world. And I can personally attest to the rigorous nature of the peer review process in this journal based on the large number of my own studies that have been rejected by this journal. But if your research isn't good, it can't get let's put it this way. If your research is good, if your research is published in this journal, it is very good research. So that's why I have faith in this finding, which is interesting because it basically showed. It's based on the NHANES data, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's been done since the 1960s in the US. They follow up with people every few years, track what they're eating and how they're doing in terms of their health. So it's based on 36,000 people, and they basically showed that even in patients with reduced kidney function, the more potassium they ate, the lower their risk for mortality. So all of this is to suggest you shouldn't be afraid of potassium in this population. And of course, you're probably thinking, well, let's just do this the easy way. Let's just give everyone a potassium supplement. We do know from studies that show that 2,500 milligrams of supplemental potassium does decrease blood pressure. But again, increasing potassium-rich foods is about more than just potassium, because part of what we're doing is we're kind of getting people we're trying to displace those high sodium foods, right? So if we get them snacking on cantaloupe melon and honeydew melon, maybe they're not going to snack on that high sodium food. Whereas putting the supplement into their diet doesn't shift their diet in the same way. And of course, the other thing is we want to think big picture. When we get our patients to eat more fruits and vegetables, we're not just decreasing their risk for high blood pressure, we're decreasing their risk for every other disease and all-cause mortality. So I always like to try to promote diet first over supplements. So all of that being said, what do we tell our patients? So one of my little passion projects is I love to find ways to translate this in simple terms to our patients in ways that are meaningful and actionable. Ever since I arrived here, I've been very inspired by our patient population because I've never seen so many like out of control diabetics and so many like really high blood pressure levels and a population that is so far, like often very open and accepting of information and appreciative of information. So like I said, I've been very inspired and I've been busy at work on the weekends trying to come up with ways to give them the information that I want them to have. So for blood pressure, this is what I've come up with. Very simple, one pager, one side. So it's like to lower blood pressure, you want to decrease your sodium, eat less of these foods. One thing I put on here is it's arbitrary, but when you look at a nutrition facts table, this is from other guidelines. I just say any food with more than 340 milligrams of sodium is a high sodium food. So people kind of have a benchmark to put into perspective what they're eating. Giving this to patients, often they're like, oh, it's the cheese. Oh, it's the cheese that I'm eating. Like I find I'm getting a good response to, or the cold cut. Some things are not really thinking about as being salty that are. But we don't want to just tell our patients what they can't eat, and we don't want to just take things away from them. We also want to give them encouragement about what they should eat. So the flip side of this guide shows you to lower blood pressure, increase your potassium intakes. And I just tell people, eat as many of these foods as possible every day, and the more of them that you eat, the better. And usually people will be like, oh yeah, I could eat a little more of this, or I could eat a little more of that. And also sometimes they're encouraged because they're like, you know what, I am doing this. And then you're validating them for something that they're already doing. So if you are interested, I have a website, nutrition-prescriptions.com. So you can get this from there and give it to your patients. I'm kind of working through these and changing them and tinkering with them as I see how people respond to them. But that's what I do for blood pressure. So we've spent a good amount of time talking about blood pressure, and we haven't even really mentioned or gotten into the DASH diet yet. So let's talk about that for a moment. What is the DASH diet? Fundamentally, it's a low sodium, high potassium diet. If you look at it, it's just this like generally healthy diet. To be honest, it looks a lot like the 1992 American Food Guide pyramid. So this is like the food guide that everybody makes fun of and says like, oh, it's so terrible. What were we thinking? What were we telling people? It's been revolutionized. But really that's basically what it is. It's just a generally healthy diet. And part of the reason it's designed this way is because they want it to be something that people can actually adhere to and something that people can actually adopt. It's not too overly strict. When you look at the numbers, so this is based on a meta-analysis of 8 randomized controlled trials of patients with uncontrolled hypertension. The average systolic blood pressure decrease is 6 millimeters of mercury, and the average diastolic decreases 3. It doesn't appear to be that much. However, keep in mind, it's a meta-analysis. This is very conservative data. And there are certain individuals who are going to get way more benefit from this diet. This is, again, at the population level, on average, what you're going to see. So some people criticize the DASH diet because they say it doesn't go far enough. And we know that if you eat a whole food plant-based diet, you can decrease systolic blood pressure by 16 and diastolic by 9. One thing that's not fair about this comparison is the whole food plant-based diets have only been tried in like trials, whereas again, the DASH diet, we're talking meta-analyses. So again, this is a bit more rigorous data, that's a bit less rigorous data. So maybe that would come down a bit when we have more trials and average them all together. But again, it just shows you that you can go farther if you want, and if you have a patient who's interested. Let's just break down what these diets really are. So we said the DASH diet is kind of like the 1992 American Food Guide. Whole food plant-based diets basically have tons of vegetables, tons of beans, your fruits, your nuts, your seeds, no meat, no eggs, no dairy, no processed food. And I think that's a really important distinction to make because I think there's a lot of confusion around plant-based diets versus vegan diets. So I think of the plant-based people as the people who just eat plants and beans. And the vegan people kind of define themselves as what they don't eat. They don't eat meat and dairy. A lot of patients come to me and they say, oh yes, I'm making dietary improvements. I'm eating less meat, which could be healthy, but then it depends on what they're replacing that meat with. And I always feel like it doesn't guarantee that they're necessarily improving their health because we know that you could be on a vegan diet, but you could still be eating vegan chocolate cake. You can still be eating Lay's potato chips. You can still be eating all these processed foods that replace meat that often have a lot of sodium or other things. So it's not a guarantee that just by taking meat out, you're automatically improving your diet. So that's something that I encounter quite a bit with patients. So that is everything that I have to say about blood pressure. So we'll recap it. So we talked about how flax seeds have potent blood pressure lowering capabilities. We talked about how increased dietary sodium is only half of the equation. The other half of the equation is our insufficient potassium intakes. We talked about how increased potassium can eliminate racial disparities in salt sensitivity. And finally, we talked about how the DASH diet is good and plant-based diets are potentially even better for lowering blood pressure. So